Welcome everyone to the OWASP DevSlop show, Down Under edition. Thanks for joining us. Today, we'll be talking to Shubham Shah, CTO and co-founder of Assetnote and prolific bug bounty hunter, about subdomain takeovers. But before we dive into that, we've got a message from our gracious sponsors at AppSec Engineer.
Application security is in more demand than ever, but companies still can't find enough talent. You could be filling those vacancies right now. There's just one problem. A career in AppSec means learning new skills in both offensive and defensive security across disciplines like DevSecOps, cloud security, threat modeling, and more. Whoa, that sounds like a lot. But don't worry, we got you covered. AppSec Engineer is an all-in-one training platform with over 30 courses in 8 fields of AppSec. Every lesson comes with hands-on labs so you can practice all your skills to perfection. All that for just one subscription, like Netflix, but good for your career. If you want to learn AppSec, you gotta do it right. You gotta choose AppSec Engineer. Get started for free today.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Feels like it's been a little while. How are we all doing?
Not bad. Yeah.
Hey.
Cool. Okay.
How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing great. Saturday morning, it's raining, so
Sounds like a vibe.
it's ideal. And yeah, we've got Shubs joining us this morning. Thanks, Shubs, for coming along.
Hey, yeah, thanks
Hey,
everyone.
Shubs.
Hey everyone, thanks for having me on. Hey guys.
Cool. And yeah, you've got some content you've prepared for us today around subdomain takeovers, which I think, yeah, it's going to be really interesting.
Yeah, I'm really excited to share this today. So this content really is for the people that already know a little bit about subdomain takeovers and kind of want to take it to the next level. And today I'll be talking about some advanced subdomain takeover techniques and mitigations and how you would defend against them, both from an offensive security side of how you would find these subdomain takeovers and also from the defensive side, how you would prevent them. So I think I might just dive straight into it and take it away. So the first thing I want to talk about today is hosted zone takeovers. Hosted zone takeovers basically is when the name server returns a refused status. For those people that may not be aware what a name server is, it's a type of DNS server. It's the server that stores all the DNS records for a domain, including A records, MX records, and CNAME records. When I talk about hosted zone takeovers, what I'm really talking about is the vulnerability that occurs when a subdomain or a zone is pointing to a set of name servers that don't actually know that that subdomain is registered on that name server, so it returns a refused status. This means that the name servers a domain is pointing to does not recognize that the domain is registered on the name server. And this is actually something that happens really often. And from my experience in bug bounties, it's something that you can make a lot of money on if you find hosted zone takeovers. And really, you can test for it in a relatively easy way. You can first obtain the name servers that a domain or a zone is pointing to using dig plus trace, like you see this command here. And then you can check the status of each name server using that zone or domain using the host command, as you see here as well. So in these commands, if you run these two commands and the host command returns a refused status for the name server, it indicates that it is potentially vulnerable to hosted zone takeover attacks. This is an example of running this command, running these commands. So you can see the dig plus trace returns these two DNS, these two name servers at easydns.com and .net, and then you run the host command, and you can see that it returns the refused status. So I know that a lot of people probably know about subdomain takeovers as you register on some sort of service and you take over the subdomain. But hosted zone takeovers are a little bit unique because of what they allow you to do and how you discover them as well. So I consider them to be a more advanced subdomain takeover technique than usual. So what do we do when we find a hosted zone takeover? So after discovering it, the most important step is to prove impact by exploiting the issue. So hosting some content or records on the subdomain. If the name server records are pointing to a service which you can register on the victim domain on, then you may have found a valid hosted zone takeover vulnerability. There's this excellent resource on GitHub that I've linked in this presentation which has a list of name servers that you can take over, that you can perform takeover attacks on. So I think this is an excellent resource that you can refer to when you do find this scenario where you find a refused status from a name server for a specific zone or domain. This resource explains all the popular name servers and whether or not they're vulnerable to hosted zone takeovers. The next thing I wanted to talk about is Route 53 hosted zone takeovers. And for a really long time, AWS Route 53 was vulnerable to hosted zone takeovers. If you would add a domain to Route 53, it would assign you 4 random name server records. Most popular way to get around this was by simply brute forcing this until you received the 4 correct name servers that your targeted domain was using. AWS resolved this last year through mitigations that are not discussed publicly, but are quite effective. However, I will say that I do know a lot of bug bounty hunters that are still finding Route 53 hosted zone takeovers and are successful in taking over these subdomains or zones.
So I got a question with this one.
Yeah.
With the brute forcing, how long does it actually take to brute force just to get the 4 name servers? Because it's kind of like luck of the draw, right? You have to kind of wait.
Yeah, but it doesn't take too long. And you can usually get the name servers in maybe 10, 15 minutes. I know some people that also have techniques that don't even require the brute forcing as well. So there are multiple ways of getting the correct name servers that you need. But the publicly known technique is the one to brute force these name servers. But yeah, it's a good point. I mean, at this point, what we've noticed in the wild is almost 80% of the time, this technique is no longer usable or workable because of the mitigations that AWS has put in. And we don't really know what these mitigations are at least it's never been publicly announced. They're kind of a little bit spooky, and no one really knows how no one in the public community really knows how they've fixed this issue.
I feel like that's so par for the course, though. Like, there's a lot of things like that, especially like in AWS land, where things happen and it's like, we're doing things, you're secure, we're fixing it all up, but we're not really going to tell you like how we do this or let you see inside the sausage factory. And I guess I can understand like why that's the case, because like the more you know, the more you can exploit. But then it's a bit of that like security through obscurity, which I'm not necessarily like 100% on board with. So yeah, it's an interesting point.
Yeah, for sure.
With other cloud providers like Azure, GCP, other ones that I can't think of at the minute.
Well, the technique for hosted zone takeovers definitely does work on other cloud providers. And I do have some slides to go over some of the ones that it does work on. To be honest, even though it took AWS a long time to fix this issue, other cloud providers have not even gotten to the point of fixing this issue. Even though it took, 4 or 5 years until AWS resolved this, it is actually pretty great that AWS made an effort at resolving this compared to the other cloud providers. But yeah, there's still things on AWS that you can do that are a bit trickier to resolve, no pun intended, but they...
Oh my God.
They're a bit tricky
Pun
to resolve,
intended. Don't lie.
All puns on this show are intended.
Yeah, but yeah, we can get into that later in this presentation as well. So I'll move on to the next thing. What about other cloud providers? Which I think is an excellent question. Azure, Google Cloud, and Linode are still vulnerable to hosted zone takeover attacks. No mitigations have been deployed to prevent against this class of subdomain takeover attacks. And in some scenarios, you still need to do this technique of like brute forcing in order to get the correct name servers. But realistically, there isn't anything stopping you from doing that in most other cloud providers. I think that, Azure, Google Cloud, and Linode still have a lot of market share, and AWS isn't the only cloud provider. And it's often that if you're looking at a large organization, they're going to be using multiple clouds. They're not just using a single cloud provider.
And just a quick question that I have, Shubs, about this. Well, it's probably more a clarification for anyone watching the stream who might not be super familiar with DNS and cloud. The actual sort of impact we're talking about here and the, I suppose, way that you would leverage a cloud-based subdomain takeover, from my understanding, is that you would then actually be able to bring maybe a domain or maybe a subdomain that has no longer been, I suppose, claimed by a company into your own account, and then do what you want with it, like register DNS records and things like that underneath there. And then obviously, host content on those domains, maybe other nefarious things that you could do if you owned one of their subdomains or domains, right?
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of impact with hosted zone takeovers, and certainly there's more impact than regular subdomain takeovers. Because of owning the zone lets you do so much more.
Right.
Like, even lets you do things like receive email on behalf of that domain. So at that point, there's even more, I guess, it's like a cascading, there's cascading effects of that beyond just having a subdomain takeover or hosting content.
Right.
There could be things like ticketing systems that allow any user with a certain domain to register internally, and you may be able to bypass these authentication mechanisms in order to access things you probably shouldn't be able to. But yeah, there's definitely a lot of impact, and I do have a slide, I think, later on some of the impacts listed out for the people that are curious about what they would report to bug bounty programs, or how they would signify this risk to their organization if they discovered this.
Nice.
So the impact, as we just discussed, you can host arbitrary DNS records under the zone that you've taken over. You can claim SSL certificates through HTTP or DNS verification. You can host MX records to receive emails sent to that zone or domain. And lastly, you can host a web server with the valid SSL certificates, with the potential of stealing HTTP-only cookies scoped to domain.com, leading to account takeover attacks. So the last point is actually pretty important. What it means is you can host a web server which has server-side scripts, which will receive HTTP-only cookies upon being visited. Even if these cookies are secure cookies, which means that they only work on SSL, you can still spin up an SSL web server by claiming a certificate, because since you own that zone and you can host arbitrary content on that zone. So often, if you're trying to prove the impact to an organization, you want to try and understand if you can do these attacks, like account takeover attacks, or receiving emails and things like that. In many scenarios, what we've noticed in bug bounties and just generally whenever we find hosted zone takeovers, the last point here about account takeovers is actually really common. It happens all the time. Just because of how complex authentication can be, it's not uncommon to see wildcard scoped cookies, where the cookies are for the whole domain, and being able to host something under that domain can lead to account takeovers. So it's certainly something that I see a lot in bug bounties, and just generally for the customers that we have at Assetnote as well. So yeah, that's really the impact that I think comes from hosted zone takeover attacks. So I want to go a little bit into the mitigations around what you can do to prevent this sort of issue from happening. And the first thing I want to go through is this concept of Devops Coherence. This is something that you'll probably be hearing about a lot during this presentation, just because of how integral it is in order to fix these issues. But essentially, whenever a DevOps process is responsible for tearing down hosted zones, whichever cloud that is, it should also delete the corresponding DNS records for any domains pointing to these hosted zones. This is the most robust solution. Unfortunately, it's also the hardest solution to get right at scale, and often it's forgotten about when developing a DevOps pipeline. Will you be successful with this? Most likely. If you've implemented DevOps coherence, and if you've implemented your DevOps processes in a coherent way, you're very likely not going to be vulnerable to things like hosted zone takeovers if it accounts for deleting the corresponding DNS records after deleting the hosted zones. So if it's implemented correctly, I think that this is a very wise strategy to take when it comes to fixing hosted zone takeovers in your attack surface.
I guess
So
by
it's a
extension,
success.
Shubs, sorry to take away from the impact of the stamp. The it's poor
Sorry.
on my part. The point about DevOps coherence, I think, is a really good one, and I actually think it's probably worth talking about as well. The fact that when we talk about DevOps, we're talking about potentially like a centralized group within an organization who is responsible for DNS records, infrastructure. And in a lot of organizations, that's not necessarily going to be the case. People talk a lot about shadow IT, where anyone with a credit card in an organization can go buy a domain, can go spin up an AWS account and start hosting some zones. So I think it's actually a good point to make that there is a case for centrally managing infrastructure, and there's a case for actually using DevOps principles to manage DNS to prevent kind of issues like this.
Yeah, I think there's also something interesting about the fact that a lot of people are scared to touch DNS, so they just don't. Like, it's always DNS, right? And it's always DNS for a reason.
Yeah,
So
I don't understand why. There's only 80, 100 RFCs to do with DNS and
And Becky
extensions.
read all. So
Beck has read all of them, probably with a glass of wine or champagne or something.
Come on, what are the numbers? Let's go.
I have read a few of them, and they are very revealing. And I think one of the things that's most revealing is what the RFC says in comparison to how you see it implemented sometimes. I think a really simple to understand example is that when you speak to most people about DNS, who have come into the industry probably in the past 5 or 6 years, they don't necessarily realize that you need to include the root DNS entry, which is the dot at the very end. And they only find out when they're at 53 fails, because AWS is no, we're not going to baby you like every other provider. You need to remember to put the dot. But one of the things that I actually find really exciting now, and I think it sort of comes into making DNS a little bit easier to manage, but you still need to understand it, is a lot of providers now provide Terraform modules for managing DNS, which I think is really, really cool. And I think this leads into a question that I have for you, Shubs, about, do you think it's more effective to automate the creation as well as the destruction of these resources? Or do you think that comes with additional risk that has to be managed?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, as long as you are managing the deletion as well at the same time, it makes sense. But I guess when I talk about DevOps coherence, I think I really do include this whole idea of creating the records, managing the records, maintaining the records, and deleting the records all as one thing. And yeah, I think that when it comes to DevOps coherence, it's not just the deletion of records that will lead you to coherence. It's the whole life cycle, and really puts the sec in DevSecOps, really. But yeah, I think that that's a good idea, managing the entire life cycle through DevOps.
Someone's going to
It's all
steal
about the
that
pipeline.
line, Shubs. I'm just sorry, really quick point. Someone's going to steal that line. I guarantee it. For a DevSecOps startup, puts the
not
sec
putting the second,
in
yeah.
DevSecOps.
Well, I
God,
feel
that
like
probably already happened.
I feel like I've had this conversation a million times where people are they're like, oh, I refer to it as sec DevOps or ops sec dev, whatever thing. But I always insist that it has to be DevSecOps, because it's like dev and ops giving security a hug. It doesn't work if it's not a hug.
Wholesome.
That's wholesome.
It's just not effective if it's not a hug. If security is driving everyone, it's not as holistic, in my opinion.
Delightful.
I like it.
Awesome.
Okay.
I'm
Slides
gonna
thoroughly
move on.
derailed.
Yeah. the next thing I want to talk about is elastic IP takeovers. Now, this is a technique that's kind of a hot topic in bug bounties, in our industry, and in general. It's also something that cloud providers really, really, really don't want you to do. So we'll talk a little bit about that and how people are actually very, very successful in doing it. So what are elastic IP takeovers? Well, when you spin up a compute instance on a cloud provider, it's assigned an elastic IP address. This IP address is chosen from a large pool of IPv4 addresses that the cloud provider owns. So, AWS owns some stupid number of cloud IP addresses in general. So do the other cloud providers. And in many scenarios, companies point DNS records to these compute instances or to these elastic IP addresses. And the issue occurs when the compute instances are torn down or the elastic IP addresses are removed, but the DNS records still exist. So this is either a process failure or a DevOps inconsistency. And for companies working at scale, this issue occurs extremely often due to oversights in the teardown process and DevOps inconsistencies. And I know earlier we talked about having a single team managing DevOps, but the reality is for large organizations, that's usually never the case. Usually there's hundreds of AWS accounts that they don't even know about who owns what team owns what, how the teams are managing it. So that is something that, really contributes to this issue. And something that we see, at least in the bug bounty side and at work at Assetnote, we see this on our customers all the time as a result of DevOps inconsistencies or process failures. So what happens to the DNS records that haven't been removed? Like how are you gonna claim that specific IP address that the DNS record is pointing to? The truth is, after many painful months of offensive security research on these cloud providers, you can't really claim a specific IP address in their IP pool. If you could, it would be complete chaos, by the way. If you could claim a specific IP, it would be chaos because you'd likely be able to take over subdomains on almost every organization, to be honest. So simply knowing about a dangling DNS record is not enough to take over the subdomain. The industry-wide technique for elastic IP takeovers at the moment still is the lottery approach.
Do you know if people actually do this, the lottery approach? Like, do you think it's like pretty widespread or?
Yeah, so definitely. The lottery approach is something that many bug bounty hunters do. It is something that is actually, even though it sounds as if it wouldn't be successful, it's actually wildly successful. It's something that just unfortunately requires a lot of time, resources, and praying that you don't get banned by the cloud provider. Because you can invest a lot of time into the lottery approach and suddenly find out that all of your accounts have been banned for whatever reason, or you've been, you're not allowed to do the lottery approach anymore. But yeah, that's even though it's something that is not technically allowed by cloud providers, it is not something that the cloud providers have fully fixed. They have tried to use anti-abuse mechanisms and banning of accounts to fix it, but really that's a band-aid fix on the larger issue at play. So yeah, the earliest memory I have of someone doing this is actually an ex-colleague of mine, Matthew Bryant. Here's a link of his research, which was a pretty decent time ago, maybe 5-6 years ago. But there have been numerous revisions to the technique from a number of researchers in the bug bounty space. And really, from my perspective, where a lot of the innovation has been happening for this has been in the bug bounty space. The concept is that you can claim and release addresses from the cloud provider and use some sort of DNS data source to work out what domains these IPs belong to, or what assets these IPs, what assets are pointing to these IP addresses. If any of the IPs claimed that you've claimed belong to domains that you're interested in, for example, your company's domains or bug bounty domains, you keep that IP address and you just rinse and repeat that process. There are specific rate limits and there are specific limits that you have in your account that prevent you from doing this at a really large scale. But I know for a fact that people have worked around these rate limits and have still been able to do this at a large scale.
I think one of the things that's really interesting that's come out of this section is that security is largely not a technical problem, because it sounds like if we had a technical fix, we wouldn't even be having this presentation, and instead it falls back to a lot of that DevSecOps coherence, processes, making sure ownership of assets internally is properly managed, and making sure that those owners have the correct processes around creation, destruction, and like that whole life cycle. And I think that's really interesting, because I think it really resonates to that point that if security was always a technical issue, we would basically all be out of a job for the most part.
Are you saying tech is about people?
Oh,
No,
spicy.
don't be ridiculous.
It's another startup tagline right there. Just saying.
You need to collect these, squat them, and then like sell them to people. It's quick maths, quick money.
Look, if any of you people on the stream are really quick at getting this off the bat and setting up your own business while we're speaking, honestly, I'll be impressed. I won't even be mad.
Just remember us. Yeah.
Yeah, you deserve it at that point.
Instead of doing like a DevSecOps training, we can just do taglines. That'll be our new thing.
Yeah, one series just on taglines, tech taglines for you. Anyway, sorry. Continue.
I do agree around the people side of things, and one of the approaches that we think that is also a valid approach is just like a process fix. So I know that not every organization has the resources to really work with DevSecOps or hire someone that can do DevSecOps for them. So for the smaller organizations that still use these cloud providers and manage their DNS manually, the fix is ultimately a process fix, and that's all about people, and that's all about how people approach certain things and how they should execute certain things. So yeah, I think people have a huge play at this, but I will also say that a lot of the mishaps that happen in bug bounty programs are due to poor DevOps or DevOps, where a lot of the creation happens completely automated, and there's no real teardown process, which causes the issue in the first place. But yeah, it is something that I think you can fix through multiple ways, including the process way as well. So the limitations of the lottery approach is that it's against most cloud providers' terms and conditions, as I was mentioning earlier. If you take this approach, it's likely that your cloud accounts are going to get banned. There are magical, obfuscated mitigations preventing extreme success. Things like rate limits, account-based IP pools, IP reuse implementations, things that will hinder your success in this technique. And really, you need a really good DNS data source or data set, because you could be claiming all the IPs in the world. If you don't have a good DNS data source, you don't know which assets they belong to, and you're not able to ultimately connect it back to domains that you care about. And one of the things that I hate about the lottery approach is that it's not targeted. It's literally a lottery, and it's expensive. So for someone to be doing this, you do need to have quite a bit of motivation to approach this and actually succeed at it. And I know a lot of bug bounty hunters that have tried to do this technique, and they've essentially given up after a number of roadblocks along the way. And I guess this is a valid strategy for AWS. Make it so difficult or painful to do this technique that people stop doing it, basically. And to some extent, that's been successful, but realistically, it's not a real mitigation against this technique. So some ideas that we've had over time around how to mitigate this again for defenders is ideas like the EIP status API, which if AWS built an API which let users query whether or not Elastic IP is allocated or not, that would allow defenders to know which subdomains they need to clean up or fix. And it wouldn't allow users to specifically allocate an IP, just to view if it's in the pool or if it's currently allocated. Unfortunately, this is a big failure. And the reason it's a big failure is because attackers could use this API as well. It wouldn't just be defenders that get value out of this.
I can picture the bash script right now.
Yeah.
All you need is like a little like pop up to just say, look, you're an attacker or a defender, and if you click attacker, it doesn't let you use it.
Please don't.
When you go to a website and it's like, please confirm you're over 18, and you're like, yes.
Exactly.
You can't stop me.
It does feel very like Wile E. Coyote.
It do be.
Yeah. The other defender mitigation is a specific EIP allocation API, and just the idea that you can allow users to specify an elastic IP they've allocated in the past. Now, AWS does allow this, like they do have this functionality, but it's like really short-lived. So I think it's like a couple of hours or even less than that. So if you, what this is suggesting is you have an API that just lets you allocate any EIP you allocated in the past with no time limits enforced. If you just ever allocated the IP, you can allocate again. This could be used if you discovered an elastic IP takeover, but you want to rectify the issue. Again, this is a big failure. And that's because two things. One, the IP that you might want to allocate again could already be allocated to someone else. So you're no longer able to get it. And two, again, attackers could very much so use this API by just accumulating a large number of IPs that they in their account, and then just going back and allocating whichever ones they want in the future. So unfortunately, sorry, go on.
Sorry, I mean, not that this is a very helpful comment. I just have this sudden vision of like a dragon on top of a pile of gold, just being like, yes.
I'm just imagining how hectic it would be to randomly reallocate IP addresses. I'm just thinking back to like when you had to manually route phone calls, and it would just be like plugging people in at random and end up like in the middle of someone's conversation.
IP switchboard operators.
We definitely know the internet basically still works that way. So
yeah, it does.
We just
also
need
give
more
very
like. Sorry, we need more people with like fancy headsets with actual plugging in. Anyway, sorry.
Shubs, will let you continue before we derail this.
No problems. All good. So the defenders mitigation, something that is a white box approach, and I think I had some people tell me that, Shubham, this is the most white hat thing you've ever done in your entire life, which I thought was pretty funny. I typically create tools and techniques and things for offensive security. I rarely do anything for the defenders. So this is the one and potentially only time that I've done something great for defenders.
Oh my God.
Which is great for preventing against elastic IP.
Like Breaking Bad. Can you break good? I don't.
Fixing good.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's this tool that I wrote earlier this year called Ghostbuster, and essentially how it works is if you've got access to all your AWS accounts and you've got access to all your DNS records, it will work out which DNS records are pointing to elastic IPs you no longer own. And really, this is a very effective technique, given that you do have access to all of your AWS accounts. If you don't have access to all your AWS accounts, this tool is going to lead to a bunch of false positives. But I think that there's still a lot of utility in something like this. And it's also something that, there is a good reason why AWS can't just put this in their platform. It's because not everyone manages all of their DNS records in AWS. They could be managed anywhere. And this tool lets you input all your DNS records, regardless of where they're from. You can input it as a file, or you can also use Cloudflare. It has native Cloudflare integration, or you can use Route 53 and Cloudflare, or you can just, that's basically all the different ways you can input DNS records in the tool. But this is, sorry, go on.
Oh, I was just going to say that this feels like it comes back to what James was saying earlier about, making sure that you do have access to all those things, and shadow IT playing into that and making it really hard to determine what you've actually got. Like that's the, as you said earlier, Shubs, like that's the downside, right? You don't always know all of what you have, and that can be really tricky.
That's the hardest part. We have customers at Assetnote that have hundreds and hundreds of AWS accounts, and then they'll go to AWS and say, hey, can you help us consolidate this? Can you help us understand where all of our AWS accounts are, or who owns them, or give us any information? And basically AWS says, sorry, we can't do that. So even if you want to go to the cloud provider and consolidate all your AWS accounts, they're not really in a position to even help you do that.
If you go full like AWS conspiracy theory on it, right, and you think about it, it's not within their best interests to reduce sprawl.
Yeah.
I really feel like
cloud doesn't want you to know.
That's right.
Honestly, the best mitigation is just what I said in the chat earlier. You just got to buy AWS, and then you have all of everything. That's it.
That'll
Simple.
unplug it all.
Why not? I have a fantastic idea. Why don't we all like put in a few dollars each? Like everyone who uses AWS, buy it, and then we can turn it into a co-op.
How much can
basically, like,
AWS
we
cost?
can-
Like $10?
Our AWS.
yeah, exactly. Just give it back to the people.
We're unionizing AWS. Cool.
Yes.
Take that,
I mean,
Jeffrey.
I'm pretty sure they're doing a pretty good job by themselves so far.
Yeah.
But we can take it a step further.
Oh my gosh.
I'm sorry, Shubs.
No, all good.
I'm not.
I think that you'll raise some good points. Like this technique is just not going to be feasible in a lot of organizations, just because of things like shadow IT. And that's why this is a success, but that's why we also go straight back to Devops Coherence, which is again a recurring theme in this presentation, but so important. And yeah, really in this scenario, you would just tear down the elastic IPs and the DNS records in the same life cycle, I guess. It's the most robust solution. Unfortunately, harder solution to get right at scale, and often forgotten about when developing a DevOps pipeline. But I guess to some extent, it still doesn't solve the problem of shadow IT, because the DevOps coherence really needs to still have control of these assets or accounts. But if you build your organization from ground up to have this, then you're going to be in a much better position to protect against this attack vector. So yep, it's a big success with DevOps coherence.
There's a question in the chat though from Didaxizer. I think I said that right. I'm sorry if I did.
Yeah, that was actually pretty good. Pretty good. I know how to pronounce it. It's like that's like 95% of the way there. So you're Gucci.
How do you? Okay.
Didaxizer, I think it is. It was like correct me if I'm wrong, friend, but this was like a randomly generated username, so I think pronunciation is up in the air. But anyway.
Anyway, the question here, which we've got up on the screen, is like, if this did occur, if this takeover did occur, the remediation is pretty quick though, right? You just remove the DNS entry.
Yeah, that's right. For both hosted zone takeovers and elastic IP takeovers, the remediation is as simple as either removing the name servers or removing the IP addresses and the A records for whatever that DNS record is. So yeah, it is a very simple mitigation.
I suppose the hard part is noticing though. Like if you don't have any monitoring or alerting around that, then it could take ages before you find out.
Yeah, that's right. And that's also why so many people in bug bounties are so successful, because a big element in discovering these takeovers is the reconnaissance side of things and knowing all your assets. So I think one of the things that a lot of organizations may not have in place is the ability to know about all of their assets from an external perspective. You can get a somewhat of a overview of all the assets you own from a white box perspective, but often that's not enough because an organization often uses multiple providers to manage DNS records, Like they could have a hosted zone on Route 53, they could have a hosted zone on GoDaddy or whatever organization, and consolidating all of that is actually quite tricky. So yeah, I think knowing about the assets you own is important, and also knowing about and mitigation is actually quite easy at the end of the day. Monitoring for this pretty hard unless you've consolidated all your DNS records and are actively monitoring for it. You'd also have to build some sort of programmatic way to monitor for it. So you'd have to probably take every hosted zone and check whether or not it returns a refuse status for the name servers that the hosted zone is pointing to. For elastic IPs, unfortunately, that's way, way harder to monitor for. You don't really know if an IP is if the server is just offline, or if it's potentially takeoverable, or if it's allocated to someone else, or things like that. You can look for signals like SSL certificates changing from one organization to another, but that's not always the best way to determine whether or not it's something that's been taken over or is takeoverable either. I think I'll move on to my next slide. I think the last section is the cloud-specific subdomain takeovers. So Elastic Beanstalk takeovers, it's an orchestration service provided by AWS, deploying applications which orchestrate various AWS services, including EC2, S3, SNS, CloudWatch, autoscaling, and Elastic load balancers. When you deploy Elastic Beanstalk, you're allocated a subdomain such as the one that I've got in the presentation. When a DNS record is pointing to Elastic Beanstalk, which has been deleted, it's vulnerable to subdomain takeovers. The impact is that you can host server-side applications on the subdomain takeover, which will often lead to things like what we've discussed earlier in this presentation, like stealing wide-scoped cookies or claiming SSL certificates and things like that. So this is another serious subdomain takeover vulnerability that is still possible on AWS for Elastic Beanstalk. There's the absolute classic, which is S3 takeovers. It's been exploited for nearly as long as S3 has been around.
I think it's vintage at this point, right?
Vintage. It's vintage for sure. And yeah, it's as simple as when you point a subdomain to an S3 bucket, and the S3 bucket either doesn't exist or has been deleted. At that point, the subdomain becomes vulnerable to takeover. It does require some brute forcing when the region name is unknown, and this is often a pain point for bug bounty hunters when they're racing to get an S3 bucket. I know a group of bug bounty hunters that are literally always racing at the same time to get an S3 bucket just because of how fast their monitoring and alerting is. But the brute forcing element, whoever gets it first gets it, I guess. It does require, there are some techniques to decloak certain S3 bucket names when it's behind CloudFront. But this is something that if you research into it, the person that has done this most well, in my opinion, is Franz Rosen. He's done a great job at coming up with different techniques to decloak S3 buckets behind CloudFront. If you search up Franz Rosen S3 bucket decloaking or something like that, I'm sure you'll find a gist on GitHub which has a script which does some of that. Don't know if it still works, but there are some techniques there that you could probably use as inspiration to come up with new techniques.
I have a question. I thought that S3 endpoints aren't region specific. So what does the brute forcing the bucket region look like?
Yeah. So in AWS, it's a good question. In AWS, S3 buckets do show up in your global view. So you can see S3 buckets globally across any region. However, when you create an S3 bucket, you still have to specify what region you want that bucket to be in.
Oh, yep.
And when you specify a region that is different to the bucket that you're trying to take, the subdomain that it's pointing to, then you'll get an error when you visit that subdomain saying that your bucket is in the wrong region. So you do need to get the correct region if you want to host arbitrary content. And that's the painful part, because let's say you pick the wrong region, then to get the right region, they're gonna have to brute force the right region, and it takes a long time for S3 to propagate those changes as well. It is something that's quite painful for people trying to do this technique.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Shubs, we also had a question from SecureCat, and they've asked if AWS Amplify would also be susceptible to a similar takeover.
That's not something that I've researched, but given that if you're able to control the subdomain element when you register AWS Amplify, and it's something that you can, if you delete it, you can reclaim the same name, then I would suspect that it's quite likely vulnerable to the same technique. I mean, it's a great thing to think about. This definitely isn't an exhaustive list that I'm presenting here. That there's probably going to be more services that are vulnerable to takeover. So I think if you were curious about Amplify, I would just give it a go, because I know that a lot of AWS services actually append a random string or a random digits to the subdomain, effectively making it impossible to take over. So if Amplify doesn't have that behavior, and it's something that's completely user controllable, and it's something that you can claim after it's been deleted again, then it's very likely that it's vulnerable to takeovers as well.
Is it dumb if I don't know what AWS Amplify is?
I've already thrown that flag up.
Yeah.
Okay,
In
cool.
the chat.
That's fine.
That's fine. It looks
I'm
like
gonna
a
Google that later.
automation thing.
In the AWS dashboard, I've never seen it before, and now I'm like, oh, I wonder what that is.
Yeah.
I feel like every
I'm
time
gonna-
I log into AWS, there's just another thing that I've never heard of. So
Another module.
I remember when like the AWS dashboard of all the services was only like one page fold,
Back
and
in
now
my
it feels like
day.
it's 2 or 3. Yeah.
You kids
It's like-
these days don't understand.
one of
it's
us
like-
on this stream still has a Hotmail account. So hey,
Yeah.
It's
S3, I
vintage,
remember
okay?
S1 and S2.
It's vintage.
It reminds me of I had to stop using Burp Suite for a couple of years because I just didn't have a utility for it, and then I got a more recent version of it, and it felt like the list of BAPs like tripled in size. And I remember thinking at one point, back in my day, I had to do this manually, and now you have like a little tool you can install, and I was so mad about it. For no
Our parents
reason
are
other
like,
than-
I work to give you a better life. And then when we have a better life, they're like, my God. You kids don't know true struggle.
yeah. So S3 takeovers.
Onto Azure.
Onto Azure. There's a lot of takeovers possible in Azure. Really, this may not be an exhaustive list, but it does cover a lot of the really popular takeovers that we do see in the wild. So Cloud App, Azure Websites, Traffic Manager, Edge CDN, API, Container Registry, Data Lake, Blob Storage, and Front Door. There's a great tutorial around how you take over some of these at the bit.ly link that I've provided. It's something that I think is a great resource that walks you through how to create these resources in Azure. The really funny thing about Azure takeovers is that it's harder to actually just use Azure and create the service than proving impact or anything like that. So I think there's very poor usability on Azure on like as an attacker, as someone who's done all of these subdomain takeover attacks, it's very painful to set up these services.
The best part is, Shubs, is like I use Azure at home and then I use AWS at work, and I 100% endorse this like position that you have taken. But I would like to also add, turning it into infrastructure as code actually makes the problem even worse, because half of the time the API hasn't been implemented, or it hasn't been implemented completely, and so you need to wait for some kind soul to like open a PR through Terraform to like get that fixed. And so half the time you're just like, it's easier to do this manually.
Yeah.
I was fully expecting you to be a Microsoft apologist, and here you are, surprising me.
Yeah, no, it's absolute trash. I hate it, and
Not this time.
I am AWS simp right now. Simping hard for them.
Someone clip that. We'll need that for later.
Yeah, it's definitely going to come back around.
So we built a lot of automations for this at Assetnote, and what was really telling, and we have automations for AWS as well, but when we built the automations for Azure, we had to basically, in many cases, write like our own APIs because the Golang SDK didn't have the relevant functions to hit these services, which was really telling to me that like I don't know, it doesn't seem like they've fully completed their SDKs such that they're in a usable state. But yeah, it's just something. If you start automating this, you'll find that automating Azure is often more difficult than automating AWS, just from my experience.
Again, back on the conspiracy theory, it only really suits them to implement the create APIs, right? From a business perspective. So
I think the other really interesting thing, not to go on too much of a tangent here, is if you use Azure DevOps and try and use your DevSecOps pipelines to build Terraform, like get the Terraform plan and then get the pipeline to build that infrastructure for you, it is a lot of effort. Like it is a lot of effort because you need to basically bootstrap a whole bunch of data storage that then the pipeline can use. It doesn't have like a nice way to just do it there for you in place. And it's difficult all the way down.
I believe that.
And I think it is like one of those big cloud conspiracies where it's like Azure really want you to use their build process where they give you like the funny little scripts instead of Terraform. So they just make it so hard.
Yeah.
I didn't know that Azure didn't support Terraform, or there was no Terraform provider for Azure.
Oh, no. So there is a Terraform provider, but they make it really, really hard to implement as part of like their DevSecOps
right.
pipeline.
Okay. Yeah. That makes sense.
I feel like it's just not as kind as GitHub, or I don't know what the AWS build process is like. I've never used that, but it doesn't feel as usable as GitHub's. But yeah, not to get on too much of a tangent here.
AWS great, Azure terrible.
TLDR.
You heard it here first.
But yeah, I agree with that. Okay. So Defender's mitigation is processes. It's not something we've talked about often in this presentation, but it is a valid mitigation, which is essentially when the resources spun down, follow a process to remove the relevant DNS records. This is somewhat a success. It might work for smaller companies that manually manage their infrastructure, but honestly, it's an inferior version of the Devops Coherence solution. It's still vulnerable to human error. So success, but the better solution is Devops Coherence. We've talked about this a lot already, so I'm not going to go over all the points, but essentially, if you manage your DevOps correctly and put the sec in DevSecOps, then you will be successful if implemented correctly. And that's all I have today.
You have to remember the DevSecOps, it's a hug, not a push.
That's so cute.
For DevSecOps. Thank you,
It's just
Shubs.
adorable.
No problems. Yeah, it was great to present. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
We had a question from Didaxizer that we said we were going to come back to potentially. Let me just find it. He said a couple of slides back when you mentioned needing to delete corresponding DNS records that point to a hosted zone. What exactly do you mean by that?
Yeah, so in that scenario, basically what's going to happen is you've deleted a hosted zone from whatever cloud provider, and you've still got a zone in your DNS records that's pointing to those name servers. So you might have a zone called subdomain.example.com that's pointing to dns1.dneseasy.com, dns2.dneseasy.net, and you need to delete those name server records specifically if you want to resolve the hosted zone takeover vulnerability.
Okay. Yeah, cool. Thanks for that. Hopefully that makes sense for you there.
No
Does anyone else have any other questions? It's like free for all right now. I don't know if there was any others that were lingering on.
Oh yeah, just a clarification here. So basically, removing the delegation of a subdomain, I think that's pretty accurate. Like you're basically removing dangling NS type records that control the delegation for that subdomain to the cloud provider's name servers.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Cool beans.
Excellent.
The other thing I wanted to say was if you haven't gone through and checked out the Ghostbuster repo, you really should, especially not just for, but certainly for the art that goes with it, because it is glorious.
There's art?
There's
That
art.
That was done by James, by the way. Credit where it's due.
James, you did this.
That's so cute. I love it.
Basically, any excuse. Like Shubs knows
To
this
do.
now. Whenever he builds something, I'm just like
Yeah.
waiting. I'm like, just say the word.
Are you me? I do this stuff as well. I'm like, any excuse to do like a logo or pixel art or whatever, I'm there.
Absolutely. Except specifically with me, it's 80s BBS ANSI art. Just
Yeah,
that.
I love that.
Completely useless at everything else.
Just
Have
for
you
more
turned this
X-Files
into-
themed tools. Sorry.
No, you're okay.
No. Just for more X-Files themed tools so that we can get more art. That's all I'm asking.
Nice.
Nice.
Yeah,
Let's
yeah.
do it.
Okay. Sorry, Beck. Go on.
No, I was going to ask James, have you considered, if not already, have you considered turning it into an SVG and then rendering it out to the console when you do the first run of it?
I
Wow.
haven't. It's very specific. It does show in the
It
toolbar.
is. Oh, okay. I
Yeah,
like
yeah,
that. I got.
There's a-
It
I went
does?
down the.
Yeah. There's a
I
whole this is something we could definitely just do like a whole stream on, but there is a way to convince UTF-8 to represent the terminal control characters that we used in ANSI. And so you can translate them instead of going down the path of doing the SVG. I kind of want to get nerd sniped by that though. So maybe that's what
I have some nerd sniping where I did some program flow and then turned that into a dot file and then rendered that out as a SVG as part of the program. So like the program can tell you about itself.
Love it.
Crimes. Absolute crimes.
Internet jail.
Straight to
As
jail.
opposed to all of the other crimes we've been discussing in this session.
This one is especially heinous.
Okay, it seems like we've hit a vein that we could probably go on for another half an hour about, but we won't. And I don't think we have any further questions. So,
There's one more.
yeah.
Before
An actual for the Ghostbuster tool, does it need to be run from, say, the top level account where the delegation exists?
So with the Ghostbuster tool, it's actually really neat. What it does is it takes your AWS config file and all the accounts that you've got assume role into or you've got access to, it will automatically use all of those accounts in order to pull the data. So what you essentially want for Ghostbuster is you want to have an AWS config file which has access to all of your AWS accounts. So whether that's assuming role, whether that's access key based, whether that's whatever mechanism, even SSO based, if it's in your AWS config file, Ghostbuster will pick it up and it will use all of the AWS accounts that belong to you from that config file. The aim of the AWS accounts is to find all the elastic IPs within all the AWS accounts. You want to have as maximum coverage as possible.
Cool. I think it seems to have answered the question. Nice.
GG. Unbelievable. I have to like dual wield pet the dogs because if I don't, they just start whining. It's just a time to be. Now she's licking my hand. Sorry, continue.
before we let you go, Shubs, I guess, do you have any other favorite resources that our audience can take a look at to learn more about this? Is there, apart from like the few that you've given us along the way, do you have any like favorite things that you like to use to help your research?
I think the thing that I've learned the most when it comes to subdomain takeovers is trying to automate the problem, like trying to automate detection. And I think in my slides, I had a link to the Azure subdomain takeovers and how you create them. When I automated that was a really good learning process. But just generally with subdomain takeovers, there's been a lot of presentations and bug bounties, I guess, that have come out of it. So if you search anything about, I guess, an inspiration for me is a lot of the work that Franz Rosen has done in the past, as well as Matthew Bryant, who originally came up with the lottery technique. So reading some of those resources will, I guess, help you understand some of these techniques and how they've kind of evolved over time. There has been further work done on these, so I would suggest searching these up, like elastic IP takeovers and things like that, and just seeing what else has been done over the last couple of years on this. There was a talk called Cloud Raccoon, which dived into some of this as well, which I would recommend as well to look into. But yeah, it's an evolving space, and this is something where if you do come up with a technique to do targeted takeovers, you're going to be a very wealthy person as a result, because there's a lot of bug bounties that are vulnerable to this.
That sounds really, really cool. It sounds like a fun space to be moving into.
Yeah, for sure. And there's just so much impact as well with these takeovers, especially the ones which you can control, like you have a web server running, for example. I guess the one last thing that I didn't talk about, which is also a sneaky thing, for elastic IP takeovers, there could still be traffic being sent to those elastic IPs. So if you just listened on all ports, you might find that there's like internal services calling back to that elastic IP. That's another impact that you can show, given you have the elastic IP.
I love that.
Nice. All right, cool. Well, I don't think at this point we have any more questions. Yeah, so I just want to say thanks for joining us today, Shubs. I think it was really informative for everyone, and I think, we've all had a great time.
Yeah, it was really informative. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone, and I really appreciate being on here. So thanks for reminding me again.
You're welcome.
Cool. Okay, that's a wrap. Thanks for joining us, and thanks from everyone from the OWASP DevSlop Down Under crew. We hope you enjoyed the show. If you found it useful, educational, just entertaining, subscribe on Twitch or YouTube, and join us on Discord to keep the conversation going. Links are in our Twitch channel. They're on the meetup page, and probably down the bottom. For our next episode, join our North American team, who will be chatting to Carlos Polop about privilege escalation in the cloud. See you later. Bye.
See ya.